the kind of archetypal lawyer tends to be a bit conservative and a bit change averse. And maybe one of the things I've done since I've been here is bring a bit more risk appetite and ambition to change and to do things differently, because I've seen it done elsewhere, and I find for me the risk is maybe not so great.
Hi, I'm Belden Menkus. Welcome to the Purposeful Strategist, the podcast that shifts the conversation about purpose and strategy from what organizations should do to what business leaders are doing and what they've learned along the way. My guest today is Matt Hotson, Group Chief Operating Officer at Mishcon de Reya, one of the UK's most distinctive law firms, known as much for its entrepreneurial edge as for its legal expertise. Matt, welcome to the Purposeful Strategist.
Hey, Belden. Good to meet you.
I suspect many, if not all, of our listeners have heard about Mishcon over the years, but I think it'd be helpful if you could tell us a bit about it and also how your current role fits into the firm.
Sure. So Mishcon de Reya is a £400 million revenue law firm, predominantly based in the UK. We do have some smaller offices in Hong Kong and Singapore. We're about 90 years old, grown from above a bank in Brixton to a reasonably sizable office in the heart of London. We have about 1,000 lawyers and about 1,500 employees in total. And the firm is probably best known for its disputes pedigree. Relative to many law firms, we'd like to describe it a disputes powerhouse. We pride ourselves somewhat on the fact that nobody wants to get a letter from Mishcon because we're good at what we do and we support our clients. We do other things as well. We do have transactional capability in things like real estate and corporate law, but really the heart of what Mishcon does is acting for its clients who are in dispute with other people. The firm has grown significantly over the last 20 years, from a 30 million pound business to a 400 million pound business, compound growth of around about 12% a year for a prolonged period of time. And we like to think we're a bit different. We pride ourselves on kind of who we are and how we go about doing what we do. And that seems to work in the sense that people seem to want to stay here and continue to progress their careers here, which is great.
And the COO role, it seems to me that could cover a lot of things. What, in your case, what does that pick up, and sort of how do you even think about operations in a law firm?
So for us, it's pretty much everything that's not being a lawyer. So that goes from the person who greets you when you're walking through the door, all the way through to the IT strategist, the HR team, finance, risk, compliance, all of the PAs, and kind of everything that is here really to support the lawyers. And I guess that's kind of how we think about it. Our job is to create the platform to allow our lawyers to be good with their clients. I try and provide some leadership and direction to that and provide the lawyers with everything they need. We don't always do it perfectly, but we do a pretty good job.
And you talked about distinctiveness. I'd certainly underscore that. It seems to be part of that distinctiveness is the sort of the culture and the values, the way the place is. Was it sort of like that from the very beginning in Brixton, or did that arise more recently? And how does that actually show up in terms of keeping some coherence in what's undoubtedly a pretty large and complex organization?
So I was never in Brixton, so I can't say definitively what happened 88 years ago, but it's been a big part of the firm for the last 15, 20 years under the most recent kind of leadership of the firm. That comes from a conscious thought to write down strategy, and for that strategy, at the center of that strategy should be a set of values that we debate and we talk about, and we make sure that they're distinctive. Culture is quite a moving thing, and we kind of often say here, whenever somebody new joins the firm, the culture changes. Everybody kind of brings something different, kind of change the culture slightly, sometimes more than slightly. And that's not a bad thing, but what we try and keep constant are those values. And I think we do that well through them not being in a frame on the wall, but them being on the table in the meetings that we have. We talk about our values a lot. We talk about, is this decision consistent with our values? When we talk about performance reviews for individuals or departments, or allocating profit, at the end of the year to the partners, a big part of that conversation is, how did this person live the values? Did they show up in the way we want Mishcon people to show up? And that keeps it current and keeps it alive. We've just actually gone through a process this year of refreshing those values, which was quite an engaged process where we got ultimately all of the partners, but a number of the partners pretty heavily involved to define and redefine what those values are and do they the right things for us. And then we've kind of, through a prolonged communication effort over the course of the last 2 or 3 months, we've been talking about those refreshed values with the partnership and with the firm more widely to try and keep them current. And that seems to work for us.
And that process, does that occur annually, every 5 years on a fixed cycle, whenever somebody thinks you need it?
So we wrote a 10-year vision in 2016. We've kind of tried to deliver that. And I think, plus or minus a bit, we have. We're just in the process of rewriting that. We took the view that in 2025, 10 years felt like a long time in front of us. So we kind of limited ourselves to 5 years this time. So we're heading towards launching what uninspiringly we've called Vision 2030. We're going to have a big event in September to launch that to the firm.
And so if I've got it right, the work around the values very much sort of partner-led, and it, even though you weren't quite explicit about it, it sounded like it started with a smaller group of partners till they kind of got comfortable with something and then shared it with all the partners.
Yeah. We had groups of half a dozen, 10 partners in forums discussing and debating and kicking things around, and kind of moderated by people from kind of the center, as it were. And, that allowed us to develop the thinking, and then that kind of coalesced together into a kind of rewriting of our values, which we then took out to the wider firm.
That's the sort of thing that some organizations reach outside for expertise, for support, a comms agency, a facilitation approach, whatever. Did you use anything like that, or was it pretty much we've got the skills and capability in-house to do what we need to do around that?
Pretty much it was done in-house, because I think we know the firm well. We've got maybe some slightly different individuals. One of the things Mishcon's done that's maybe different to some law firms is we've hired very senior individuals into some of our corporate functions, and some of those are partners of the firm. That gives us, I think, maybe a little bit more firepower than some professional services firms might have.
And same kind of general approach for the strategy, or did you do something different around that?
Similar. Again, a kind of combination of some smart people at the centre thinking hard about it, engaging with partners and developing thinking in those partner forums, but also involving the kind of leadership of the business in terms of getting them to think about strategy. We're blessed with a talented strategy director, ex-McKinsey, who has led that process with a very kind of clear sense of write a few words down which are good quality rather than writing pages and pages of stuff that nobody will ever read. So we've kind of tried to limit ourselves genuinely to kind of 1 to 2 pages per department, per kind of strategic focus area. And that's served as well, I think. I think it's forced us to focus and allowed us to have better quality debates.
Is there sort of a separate strategy within that for the kind of operations side of it? Or is it, no, the strategy is the strategy. We're just here to help with the how?
No, definitely there's something unique to ops. So the ops group is actually hived off into a separate entity, and so kind of legally exists in its own kind of unit, as it were. We did spend time with each other thinking about, well, what are we really here for? What is ops's role in life? And we came up with this concept. We said, look, that involves 3 principal objectives. First of all, to protect the assets of the firm, to make sure that we are building strong foundations for the firm, whether that's about policy or it's about IT security or it's about the way that the knowledge that the firm, we're a knowledge business, the knowledge that the firm curates and looks after. So protection was number one. Second was this concept, was a concept of enablement. We're here, as I said earlier, we're here to enable the lawyers to spend the maximum amount of time either with their existing clients or in finding new clients, and to make sure that that time that they spend with their clients is valuable to the client and by implication, therefore, valuable to us, because that's how we make our money. And then finally, to help us grow the firm. We're here to help the firm grow, and growth is an imperative if you're going to keep people interested. People need to kind of feel that they're rising through the pyramid of life, within the firm, and for that to work, you either have to sort of take a brutal kind of the bottom 10% have to go every year, or you have to grow the firm every year to create more interesting work for everybody every year. And we take the latter approach, that we think that's more consistent with our values. And then within that, we've tried to challenge ourselves to say, how do we measure success? How do we create really measurable strategic objectives? So we have 5 of those. One is about cost efficiency. It's about kind of how do we kind of maximize our contribution to the firm by taking as little of the revenue as we can, to do what we do, and therefore leaving as much as possible into the profit pool. A second is about maximizing fee earner time. So we have this objective of saying, well, how do we get the amount of time a fee earner spends on admin down to 20 minutes a day. The third is about kind of employee engagement. How do we drive engagement of employees across the whole firm, not just within ops? Are we enabling the firm to do that? The fourth is about developing our brand and making sure that we are creating the best halo effect possible for partners, having conversations with potential new clients to want to join us. And the final is to try and deliver what we've described as a technology dividend to the firm, to say, look, how can we enable additional profit opportunities from successful deployment of technology, either through reducing costs or creating revenue opportunities, such that the firm is bigger and more profitable because of our careful deployment of technology than it might have been had we not done that.
For me, that's really interesting. One of the things that you sort of touched on there, buried under the word technology, I assume is AI. That's a debate that could go on forever, so I don't necessarily want to spend a lot of time on that. But I do wonder, when you think across all of those, do you see the role of operations being fundamentally different 5 years from now? Is it likely to be more integrally involved in driving revenue rather than just sort of this isn't quite how you said it, but it almost sounds like we're a fairly neutral platform that talented lawyers can operate from, and we do a little bit to help around the brand and stuff like that. Does technology, and maybe within that AI or other things, change that so that operations sort of becomes a bigger part of the equation?
Yeah, I think probably, hard to tell. I think there's lots of kind of uncertainty as to where all that's heading, but I think our best read of the future is, that distinction that I drew out between lawyers and non-lawyers, unfairly characterized by some as fee earners and fee burners in the old school, that starts to break down. And I think we definitely recognize that the kind of things that clients will want for us will still include legal advice, but they'll start to include other things as well. And some of those things will be provided by non-lawyers, somewhat kind of with the skills that our operations group has. And we're already seeing some of that. We have a big e-discovery business, we have a big cyber consulting business, and these are people who are kind of non-lawyers delivering services to our clients using technology and other skills that in and of themselves are significant revenue opportunities for the firm. And we think that AI is only going to accelerate that AI will demand a different approach to lawyering that will require a different set of skills. And AI is definitely kind of challenging us in what it might mean for a traditional sort of time and materials law firm in ways that I don't think we really fully understand how it's going to play out for us, but we're definitely alive to that risk. And I think a big part of that, the future is going to be a kind of much more blending and blurring of the skills boundary between lawyers and non-lawyers. It does feel like the future of professional services, the future of law, is going to be much more of a team sport of shared endeavor between lots of different skills. And I think we're well placed to tackle that.
To bring it sort of back round to you for a second, do you think that shifts what Mishcon or other firms that want to be at the top of their game need from their COO? Do you feel that shapes a bit what's likely to be asked for from you and others who are in similar roles?
Probably. I think what Mishcon wants from me right now is a combination of some external perspective. I've not spent all of my career working in law firms. I've done all sorts of different things, and I think I'm better in this job because of that. So that's definitely one thing. I think with that, there are some big decisions to make. In pursuit of that operations strategy, we've had to make some bold decisions. One of the bigger ones, has been the decision to establish a presence in a global capability center in India and move some of our work out to that center, somewhat in pursuit of that cost ambition I talked about, but also in pursuit of improving service. And so there's definitely a premium on making the big calls and executing well. Something I think I brought to Mishcon is a kind of execution drive, which says this is about doing what we said we're going to do well. And I think that will be a bigger part of our future. We've kind of identified that. The kind of archetypal lawyer tends to be a bit conservative and a bit change averse. And maybe one of the things I've done since I've been here is bring a bit more risk appetite and ambition to change and to do things differently, because I've seen it done elsewhere, and I find for me the risk is maybe not so great.
Something I suspect is part of your thinking is the risks of doing something are all pretty apparent. The risks of not doing something often are, one might argue, as big, if not bigger, but sometimes hidden.
Yeah, I think that's true. And partly implicit in that is not doing something, the impact happens slowly. Doing something, the impact happens significantly. And so the risk of not doing something is often that you don't realize that you should have done something, until it's too late. Sometimes one has to point that out, and sometimes one has to make the big calls. Sometimes those things are difficult, but making them and getting the other side of that decision is generally a good feeling.
You talked about this sort of moving some of your operational capabilities outside the UK. If you could, talk us through how that came about.
So we spent some time 12 months or so ago thinking hard about the kind of operating model for operations. What are we here for? What do we have to do? And that was sort of partly driven by some data. As an example, we have two buildings in London next door to each other, and generally speaking, the operations guys are in one building and the lawyers are in another. And I looked at the swipe card data to say, how many times does anybody actually go to both buildings in a day? And the answer is pretty infrequently. And so whilst there's a comfort in co-location, and feeling like the billing team or the credit team or the HR administration team or whoever else it might be are, kind of only just next door. The reality is that we never spend any time in the same room as each other. So then when you kind of look and say, well, we're paying a lot of money for London real estate, and London salaries for that, it kind of makes you scratch your head and go, is that the right solution? So there was some good data analytics which kind of helped inform that thinking on an operating model, as well as kind of, some, I guess, sort of semi-academic thinking about, well, what are our alternatives here? And we kind of came to a conclusion that we could think about what we do as kind of four layers of functionality. One of which is kind of the head office-y type work, setting policy, setting direction, leadership, management, those kind of things. Two, the business partnering work, actually sort of spending time in the business and helping them hire people or performance manage their business or help their business grow. Thirdly, the kind of infrastructural parts of the business, whether that's the IT estate or the physical premises of the building and things like that. And finally, the operational parts, the things where we actually kind of do processing on behalf of the business, whether that's billing or chasing clients or recruiting people, onboarding new staff, onboarding new suppliers, running payroll, a kind of whole host of things. And we kind of concluded that aspects of that operations function needn't be done in London because there was limited need for co-location and there was opportunities to do it elsewhere. And then we ran a process to kind of fly around the world and look at all sorts of parts of the world and what alternatives could we have. And we kind of alighted on India as the logical place for us to go for all sorts of reasons. I think in truth in life, you probably only really make a few big decisions a year, and that was one of my decisions last year, definitely. One of those kind of times where you kind of go, the organisation is looking at me to make this decision, so I ought to kind of go away and think about it hard and make sure I'm making the right one. And yeah, I say I don't think that happens more than a few times a year, but that was definitely one of them.
Yeah, yeah. Is there any particular kind of process you go through for yourself when you're facing a big decision like that?
I don't know that I possess some brilliance that makes me better at coming to a better decision than other people. I definitely, in that decision, I listened to lots of people. There were lots of opinions around the table and lots of people had perspectives on it. Some I agreed with, some I didn't. But there's definitely some wisdom in crowds, in making those kind of decisions. I tried to think logically about it. When somebody says, well, why did you do that? I try and kind of sort of lay out that sort of logic trail in my head and write it down and say, look, here's the logic as to why I think us moving offshore is the right thing to do and why India is the right choice for us. And so I kind of tried to lay that out and, gave myself a bit of time and space and, and privacy to make that decision and then make it and don't unmake it. So I kind of went into print on it, wrote down my thoughts, and I shared it with lots of people and said, here's where we are. This is what I'm going to do about it. Decision making isn't difficult, and probably most of the time executing well on a 70% decision is better than wasting lots of time to make a 100% decision and executing poorly on it.
Yeah, I completely agree. Make up your mind and then get on with it. If you don't mind my asking, you sort of alluded to it, but I think it'd be interesting just to hear a little bit more about it. You have had a career that's covered a number of different sectors and roles and all this of that. I'd be interested if you wouldn't mind just to get a quick view of that for people who are listening. And then if you've got any thoughts about that you might want to share with other people as they think about their careers. I just think that you've had a pretty unusual journey through some of it.
I've meandered through life doing different things, most of which with some sense of purpose and occasionally with a bit of kind of luck. I'm a scientist in terms of my first degree. I spent 3 years studying pharmacology, realized that much as I enjoyed the subject, being a research scientist wasn't my calling in life. So I decided I needed to get a different career. I ran a pub for a year just for something to do and then started properly working in retail banking at NatWest. Did 6 or 7 years at NatWest. Jumped from there to Legal and General, where I spent 14 years doing a whole variety of things in an organization that was very good at backing young talent and taking a risk on people. And I was fortunate that they took some risks on me, and I ran some business units. I ran their direct distribution arm for a couple of years. And I ended up in a group strategy director role and then latterly running investor relations. And I used that investor relations experience to jump into telco for a while. Cable and Wireless Worldwide, sold Cable and Wireless Worldwide to Vodafone, and then jumped back into insurance at Royal Sun Alliance, again in investor relations, and then sort of decided to reinvent myself as a CFO and was the UK CFO at RSA for a few years. And then used the CFO badge to jump into my first listed CFO role at a distressed debt asset manager called Arrow Global. Ended up selling that to private equity a few years ago and then jumped to Mishcon, initially as CFO when Mishcon was thinking about an IPO, and then latterly, as we've discussed, as COO. And somewhere along the way, managed to squeeze a master's degree in and a PhD just because that was sort of partly, I felt there were things that I needed to do in life. What's my advice? I think don't be constrained by convention and that you have to follow a linear path through life. I've kind of jumped around, as I've demonstrated quite a bit, and including doing, roles where some people would say, well, when along the way did you become an accountant to learn to be a CFO? And I didn't, but because I'm not sure that you need to be an accountant to be a CFO. I think if you're good enough, you can do all sorts of things. I think find things you enjoy doing, and if you enjoy doing them, then you'll do them well. That's worked for me. I think there's always been a bit of design in my thoughts to say, well, where do I want to get to and how do I navigate my way around that and how do I build an experience set that positions me well for the jobs I want to do. And there's, probably a reasonable amount of self-belief has helped me as well, that I've kind of always backed myself to say, well, I can do that job and therefore I'll put myself forward and go and do it. Been supported by some great leaders along the way as well who've taken risks on me, which helps. I think it's also finding good managers. Go work for good people who will give you the chance. Definitely helps too.
Maybe a cheeky question, but where do you see next for yourself?
I've still got a bit of work to do here at Mishcon. So for the next few years, I want to kind of complete the work I'm doing here at Mishcon. And maybe that will be me done from a full-time executive career, and I'll go and either learn some different skills at home or maybe offer my skills to some places on a part-time basis. I already do one non-exec role, which I enjoy a lot. So who knows? I mainly want to enjoy life. And most of the time when I've been working, I've managed to the work has been enjoyable, and hopefully that continues. And if something interesting turns up, then I'll go and do it. And if it doesn't, then I'll find something else.
It sounds like at some point, maybe a distance in the future, you will be leaving the current role. As you leave, if there's one sort of remaining, enduring change, shift you would have left, what would it be?
I hope by the time I'm done here, who knows when that will be, I will have taught the firm the value of good execution and sticking to a plan and just relentlessly getting stuff done. It's got real value. I think that's what I'm trying to teach Mishcon. I don't know whether we're fully there yet. I think we've still got things to learn, but good strategy helps a lot, but good execution is more important.
That sounds to me like a view, which again, I tend to agree with, which is it's better to be moving in roughly the right direction and kind of course correcting as you go if you need to, than spending a lot of time making sure you're absolutely 100% lined up around the direction.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that.
Well, Matt, thank you for sharing your experiences and your sort of worldview, because I think that's part of what it is sort of a sense of the way the world works, and that there are risks out there, but actually it's not stacked against you to try, that it's okay. You can do some things and see how they go.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining us.
Thanks very much.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of The Purposeful Strategist. In addition to being available on our website, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. If you enjoyed this episode, please do follow us and leave us a 5-star review. It helps others find the podcast. Thanks again, and join us soon for the next episode of The Purposeful Strategist.